Today we shift our attention to yet another Hellenistic foundation, Antioch on the Orontes, which had a large impact on the course of history. In this video, we will cover the course of Antiochene history from the foundation of the city by Seleukos I all the way until the Middle Ages and the role that Antioch played in the Crusades. Holy hand grenades, of course, are a reference to Monty Python. If you don't get the reference, you should strongly consider watching the Monty Python films. The wars of Alexander's successors raged from 323 to 281 BCE. During this time, many of the men who had fought alongside Alexander died prematurely, while others were able to make some startling comebacks. No one made a more startling comeback than Seleukos I Nicator, who started out as the ruler of Mesopotamia until he was ousted by Antigonus the One-Eyed, who was on the verge of victory at one point. Seleukos was then able to reclaim his homeland, fend off a massive invasion by Antigonus, and then go on to become the new power player in the Macedonian world. Had he not been assassinated in 281, it's possible Seleukos would have succeeded in reunifying all of Alexander's possessions. We should not let his success blind us to the fact that his success was highly unlikely and that it was contingent upon both his skill, luck, and the aging out of Antigonus the One-Eyed. But let's not get too into the details of the Hellenistic period in that regard. Seleukos was able to carve out an empire centered around Mesopotamia, and by 301, following the defeat of Antigonus the One-Eyed at the Battle of Ipsus, he was the most powerful of the successors and would remain that for the remaining 20 years of his life. For most of the rest of the Hellenistic period until very late, the Seleukid Empire was far and away the largest and most powerful of the successor states to Alexander's empire. And because Antioch would emerge as one of the capitals and then later the capital of the empire, it was accordingly powerful, important, wealthy, and cultured. Just like Alexander, Seleukos followed the practice of founding new cities and naming them after either himself or some of his relatives in order to build legitimacy and attract settlers. It turns out that Seleukos' father was named Antiochus, and this is also the name that he gave to his eventual son and heir. In fact, although it is called the Seleukid Empire after Seleukos I, there were only 7 rulers to claim the name Seleukos, while there were 13 rulers to go by the name Antiochus. Following the foundation of Seleukos' independence in 312, he spent his early years fighting in the east. When he returned to the west, he decided that he needed to strengthen his hold in this region. For the most part, his strength lay in what had been the Persian Empire in the interior. However, he was interested in the coast. He was, after all, a Greek, or actually Macedonian, I suppose, but he wanted access to the traditional realm of Greekdom, which is the Mediterranean. And he knew that there was a good possibility that either Ptolemy or Antigonus to the north might manage to deprive him of Syria if it wasn't properly defended. At this time, there were not all that many Greek settlers in Syria, so there were no populations who were specifically loyal to Seleukos, despite his overall popularity with native populations, especially when compared to other successors. In order to try to shore up his position in Syria, Seleukos created the so-called Tetrapolis. This is a system whereby he founded 4 cities, 2 inland and 2 coastal, 1 coastal and 1 inland in both the north and the south of Syria, in order to strengthen his control and make sure that there were strong areas which would resist any enemy invasion. He decided to name these cities after himself and his relatives. All of these cities ended up being pretty important and successful. In southern Syria on the coast, he founded Laodicea. This was named after his mother, and it was an important port for many centuries. On the inland of Syria, he founded Apamea. This was another city which was not quite as successful as the others, but still had a pretty good run of things. It was actually named after Seleukos' Sogdian wife Apama. And part of the reason why Seleucus was popular with the native populations is because his only wife was a Sogdian, which is an area kind of to the north of Bactria, so sort of in the Afghanistan or slightly north of Afghanistan region today. And this also means that Seleucus' son and heir Antiochus I is half Sogdian, and this would make him also more acceptable to most of the subjects of the empire than some of the purely Macedonian successors and their sons. One of the major sites here at this time in the north was Seleucia and Perea. This was a coastal city not far from Antioch, and it was supposed to give northern Syria sea access. If I had to guess, I would think that Seleucia and Perea was originally intended to be the powerhouse city because it is more easily accessible than Antioch. And also we have to keep in mind that the real capital of Seleucus' empire was actually Seleucia on the Tigris, a city which was built near Babylon and was siphoning population away. The city which ended up becoming the capital of the Seleukid Empire, and which is the subject of this video, is Antioch on the Orontes, also called Syrian Antioch. It was named after Seleucus' father. It was inland in northern Syria and defensive in nature. After the foundation of the Tetrapolis, there won't be too many more Laodiceas or Apamias. However, there will be a lot more Seleukias and Antiochs. Antioch was usually referred to as either on the Orontes or Syrian in order to distinguish it from the 15 or so other Antiochs around the Seleukid Empire. The other most prominent Antioch, and one which has survived largely intact to this day, is Pisidian Antioch. Confusingly enough, both of them are located within the boundaries of modern Turkey, so when you look for pictures of the ruins of Antioch, you often end up getting the city that you're not looking for. Although it is called Syrian Antioch and it was within the ancient boundaries of Syria, today's Antioch on the Orontes is actually located within the boundaries of Turkey, but just barely. So it is on the border of Turkey and Syria, effectively. Similar clarifications, some of which reference a nearby river or region, were required for the various Seleucia sites as well. Seleucia on the Tigris is the best known of these sites because it was the original capital, and it played a big role for centuries in that region until it started to die out in late antiquity. But usually if you see Seleucia, it's referring to the city on the Tigris, and if you see Antioch by itself, we're usually talking about Antioch on the Orontes. However, that is something that modern scholars observe much more systematically than ancient scholars did. So if you see an ancient text and they just refer to Antioch, they might not necessarily be talking about Antioch on the Orontes, Antioch of the Holy Hand Grenades, and all of that. As I mentioned earlier, Seleucia on the Tigris was the original capital of the empire, and Antioch was founded as sort of a major defensive center in the west, and possibly as a kind of western capital, or at least a staging area for Seleucus to hold off any invasions from the north and serve as a jumping off point to invade through the Taurus Mountains into the north. However, over time, the empire will become more western facing, and its rulers will become more interested in holding on to territories in Anatolia and trying to gain land there. So this means that Antioch will increase in importance because it is closer to those regions, whereas Seleucia on the Tigris will largely become the residence of the heir apparent who is left in charge of the east. This also means that the east gets neglected in terms of resources and focus on the ruler's part, and this contributes to the loss of the eastern provinces over time. So this becomes a sort of feedback loop where as the east is neglected and it loses power to resurgent natives like the Parthians, Antioch will really solidify itself almost by accident as the most important city in the empire, and it will simply just become the capital by default almost. There is an interesting apocryphal legend where Seleucus decided to build a city on the site of Antioch because an eagle carried away a piece of sacrificial meat and then flew up to Mount Silpius and left the meet there. More likely what happened is that he simply noticed that this was defensible terrain and that it was located reasonably close to the passes of the Taurus Mountains, so it was a way for him to put a huge barrier in the way of any armies invading from the north, and also give himself that jumping off point to invade the north, as I mentioned earlier. It's also a well-watered site. It is right along the Orontes River, and if the Mount Silpius is anything like a lot of the mountainous acropolises of Greece, then there are springs within it, and this could sustain a garrison during a siege. There is a fairly nearby foundation of Seleucia Perea, which we've talked about already. This was part of the Syrian Tetrapolis. And the function of Seleucia Perea, I think originally was probably to be the main city of Syria, but over time what ends up happening is that it actually becomes more or less the port of Antioch, rather than being all that significant in its own right. Now, eventually under the Romans, Seleucia Perea will then take off again and become a relatively major site for a time, but for the most part it is just there to service the needs of Antioch. Antioch is also well positioned because it is right along the Silk Road coming from China and the Persian Royal Road coming from Iran. This means that communication and travel to and from Antioch in regards to the east is much easier than most other cities, while at the same time it's not all that far from the Mediterranean coast, so it is extraordinarily well positioned for trade of the overland variety. This means that Antioch will become very prosperous very quickly, and this is how it attracts a large population. The big downside to Antioch is that, like most places in the Mediterranean, but to a higher degree, it is very prone to earthquakes. And we'll see that Antioch was devastated by earthquakes on many occasions throughout its history. Antioch was founded years after Alexandria, and Alexandria had already become famous for its useful grid pattern. Therefore, Seleukos's architect Xenarius decided to imitate the grid of Alexandria and adapt it to the terrain of Antioch. Over time, Antioch expanded and grew, but it always stuck with the grid pattern that Xenarius had laid out, and it will develop into a city with 4 distinct districts. During the time of Seleukos I, he set up an acropolis on Mount Silpius and also settled some of the low-lying parts of the settlement, bringing in some settlers from a nearby city at Antigonea, of course founded by Antigonus. This shows me that Seleukos's primary purpose was to create a defensible city which would help to hold down the fort in the event of an invasion, and that he envisioned it mostly for that purpose. A lot of the other purposes would have emerged later as it became more important administratively and as it showed its trade value. The second quarter of the city was established soon after by Seleukos's heir Antiochus I, and this quarter was set up mainly to house non-Greek natives, and it featured its own city walls. So this was a separate quarter, but it also shows most likely that the city was developing a lot of commercial prosperity. The third district was built on an island in the Orontes. This would have been a fairly safe area, and it also held a number of government buildings. This was constructed by Seleukos I and his successor Antiochus III the Great, so this district would become very prominent in the city's future, but it actually was relatively late in terms of its construction. The fourth and final section of the city was built by Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the infamous king who claimed to be the revealed god Dionysus in action. He founded the fourth and final section in a mountainous area, and it shows his concern for defense because it is another very formidable part of Antioch's defense. Let's take a brief look at the accomplishments of some of the most famous rulers in Seleucid history, and this will enable us to see the Seleucids at their peak and then at the start of the decline that would eventually bring down the empire as a whole. Seleukos I Nicator was, of course, the founder of the empire. He declared himself to be a king in 305. He ruled down until his assassination in 281. He's pictured on your screen. He was a relatively minor general under Alexander who ended up founding an empire which encompassed much of what was once Persia. And as I mentioned, he was assassinated after he had just defeated Lysimachus, and he was in the process of annexing Macedon and Greece. Had he succeeded in doing that, he would have then been able to move on against Egypt, which would have been without an ally and more or less at his mercy. All he had to do was to stay alive. He was in his late 70s by this point, but he was still very vigorous and able to campaign in person, so most likely he would have been able to last a few more years and see that project through. It was not to be, however. Antiochus I Soter was the heir apparent of Seleukos. He also, as I mentioned, was half Sogdian. He kept up his father's focus on the west, giving his son control of the east, and he tried to avenge his father's death as well as keep the recently conquered peoples of Anatolia in line. And for the most part, he was successful, although he did lose a couple of major battles and ended up dying shortly after a major military defeat. Antiochus III the Great came after a series of somewhat mediocre rulers, and he was then able to really revitalize the empire's military fortunes. However, he ultimately was unsuccessful despite his reputation for greatness. He had to recognize Bactrian independence after the Greeks there revolted and set up their own kingdom. He was able to reduce them to a state of siege, but he was not able to actually oust them or force them to submit, so he just extracted money and left. He then came back to the west and took up an anti-Roman stance. He overran much of Anatolia, and he was in the process of invading Greece, so he had brought the Seleucids back into power. However, he then clashed with Rome, and just like all of the other Hellenistic powers who tried to fight Rome, he ultimately failed, and this rolled back Seleucid ambitions in Anatolia and more or less kicked them out of much of what they had gained under Antiochus. As for Antiochus IV, he took over where Antiochus III had started, but instead of focusing on conquest, he tried to focus on internal reforms to create Greek cultural homogeneity, which he thought would then serve as a center of strength the empire could build around as it strove to recover its ancient glory. However, this process of cultural homogeneity ended up alienating a lot of subjects, including, most notably, the Jewish people under the Maccabees. The Maccabees were a fairly obscure family who managed to lead a revolt in order to preserve their religion and way of life, and against all odds they managed to repel the Antigonid armies. This was a humiliating defeat for Antiochus IV, and after the Maccabean revolt, the Seleucid Empire will be in full-scale decline. Interestingly enough, however, this decline does not really affect Antioch too much, at least not in a negative sense. The oddest thing about Antioch in the Seleucid period is that we don't know much about it despite its reputation as a thriving city, an intellectual center, and the home of some of the most powerful and interesting rulers of the time. We also don't have very many remaining parts of original buildings from this period. We know that the original settlers were mostly taken from the nearby city of Antigonium, and that there were additional Greeks brought in, and also a fairly large number of Jews who were incorporated as full citizens. It seems the Seleucids were a little bit better at integrating non-Greek populations than the Egyptians had been, but part of this is because a lot of the Jews had already been Hellenized anyway, or they were starting to show signs that they were willing to go that route. There are still some remains of the famous Greek theater near Mount Silpius, but a lot of those have been supplemented heavily by Roman construction, so the Greek parts are somewhat few and far between. We don't know the names of most of the famous Antiochene thinkers of the Hellenistic period, but we do know that there was a Stoic philosopher named Apollophanes, and also Phoebus, who was a writer who talked about dreams. Perhaps he did something like a dream interpretation along the lines of Sigmund Freud, or else it was looking for signs from the gods in your dreams, which is a little more likely, sort of a dream divination text. The two chief Greek deities of Antioch were Apollo and Daphne. However, most of the other cults in the city seem to have been local, or the kind of syncretic gods we talked about in Alexandria, gods who were taken up by the Seleucids in order to represent a harmony between the new ruling class and the natives of the area. Seleucid history after the death of Antiochus IV makes for some pretty depressing reading. The Seleucids rapidly lost ground on nearly all fronts at all times. The Parthians in the east especially benefited and carved out an empire which was in most ways the successor to the Achaemenid Persian Empire of earlier times. It was never quite as powerful, but it became more powerful than the Seleucid state by a point during this period between 164 and 65 BCE. By the 1st century BCE, the Seleukid Empire was little more than Antioch and its immediate surroundings. Perhaps they still controlled most of the Tetrapolis, but outside of Syria, the Seleukid Empire was no longer extant. The late Seleucid kings fought each other constantly. These kings were unimpressive and unpopular, and most of them tended not to reign for very long before they got embroiled in a civil war with some brother, cousin, uncle, or some other male relative. There were also generals who would revolt who were not members of the royal family, so it was a confusing time, and it produced many rulers, almost all of whom proved to be not very good at what they did. The people of Antioch, for their part, became fed up with the Seleucid monarchy, and in the late 80s BCE, they actually asked the king of Armenia, Tigranes, to invade and conquer them in order to rid them of the Seleucids. In 65, they actually begged Pompey, when he was coming through the region, not to allow King Antiochus XIII to return to power. Antiochus XIII is pictured on this coin. In 65, when Pompey came through, he decided to annex Antioch and also Judea without a fight. While there was some regret about this occurring in Judea, where they had enjoyed independence since the time of the Maccabees, in Antioch the people were quite happy to now be Roman subjects. It was better than being under the feuding kings of the Seleucids, after all, and Antioch would actually prosper more under the Romans than it had under the Seleucids. It was during the Roman period that Antioch actually reached its peak of prosperity and population. At some point between the late Hellenistic and the early Roman period, that is, the period right after Pompey's annexation of the area, Antioch actually reached its peak population figure of about 500,000 people. However, over time this population would fluctuate a great deal due to major earthquakes devastating the city, and then it being repopulated slowly over time following its recovery. The population dipped as low at some times as 150,000 or so, but most scholars think that the average was maybe 250,000 or so inhabitants at any given moment in Roman imperial history. Antioch was the third largest city of the empire for most of its history, up until the foundation of Constantinople, which then rose to overtake Antioch and in time Alexandria as well. But for the most part, Antioch was something like the Chicago of the Roman Empire. It was a large city, which was approximately the third largest in the realm. Its importance also meant that Antioch was the object of a pretty significant amount of imperial largesse, and it was a stopping off point that most emperors would hit up on their way if they were going east or traveling through the region to go elsewhere. Antioch was one of the most important early Christian sites, and it was absolutely critical to the expansion of Christianity. Antioch, as I mentioned earlier, had a fairly large Jewish population, and they had been taken in as full citizens of the city so they were more powerful vis-a-vis the rest of the city than most other Jewish populations in other Roman urban centers. Not to mention, Antioch was quite large, so that helped a lot when it came to trying to spread their religion to other people. Reputedly, according to the book of Acts, Antioch hosted both Peter and Paul on many occasions. The famous confrontation between Peter and Paul about the issue of Judaizing occurred at Antioch. Basically, Peter wanted the Gentile converts to be forced to adopt Jewish practices such as circumcision, avoiding pork, etc., whereas Paul thought that those were not necessary for non-Jewish people to practice. So they got into a pretty heated argument over that. Paul eventually won out, or at least got Peter's begrudging permission to do things his way. At any rate, Antioch, because of this early spread of Christianity there, gained a reputation earlier than most cities for being an especially Christian center. By the time that the empire as a whole is going Christian, Antioch will be much further along the path than most other cities, and for non-Christian visitors, it apparently could be a little uncomfortable at times. The most famous Antiochian Christian was John Chrysostom. Chrysostom means golden tongue. He was one of the early church fathers who later served as Patriarch of Constantinople up until his death around 407 or so CE. Interestingly enough, Chrysostom's name is quite fitting given that one of Antioch's most famous institutions was a school of rhetoric. Chrysostom has some surviving writings, including a large number of homilies, most of which cover what we would think of as ethical issues rather than theology. So he talks about living your life and what the Bible teaches about X, Y, or Z. Those are most of his surviving works. These are delivered in front of larger audiences, so these were pretty accessible to the average person in his congregation. So Chrysostom was in fact a rhetorician in both name and in terms of the surviving stuff that we have from him. There were many emperors who either visited Antioch directly and then bestowed largesse upon it in person, or who ordered that it be given certain amenities from afar in order to ensure the continued loyalty of the citizenry. The first Roman emperor, Augustus, decided to order the construction of a temple of Jupiter Capitolinus on Silpius, the Acropolis of Antioch, and he was also the probable patron of the circus at Antioch, which was large enough and modeled on the Roman circus. It could house up to 80,000 people at a time, so this would have become the new centerpiece of the city of Antioch, and they owed it to the Emperor Augustus. A client king of Rome and Judea, Herod the Great, was responsible for sponsoring a long stoa in the eastern portion of the city. Tiberius, Augustus's successor, started to enlarge the original Greek theater, a project which was only finished by Trajan. It's because of this Roman enlargement program that a lot of the original Greek portions of the theater have been lost to us today. Antoninus Pius decided to have one of the roads near Antioch repaved with granite. Trajan was present for the earthquake of 115. This was late in his reign. He died in 117. He had to take refuge while the earthquake was going on and in the immediate aftermath. And then he and his cousin/successor Hadrian worked very hard to restore the city by bestowing upon it gifts, tax exemptions, and other forms of largesse. Hadrian also authorized the construction of one of the city's finest aqueducts, which made life easier for the citizens at Antioch. Antioch was originally a frontier city, and during its entire Seleukid history, it was generally prepared to receive any foreign foe with force. This meant that the defenses were maintained, troops were there, and the natural features of Antioch were incorporated as well as possible into the defensive plan. Following the Roman conquest, however, Antioch became more of an interior fallback position, and therefore the defenses were maintained with a great deal less vigor. If anything, the Antiochenes themselves became very complacent about their own security. In 256, during the so-called 3rd century crisis, the Sasanian Persian ruler Shapur I was able to penetrate the frontier and then capture Antioch. He ended up rounding up and killing many Antiochenes in the theater. The city was soon retaken by the Emperor Valerian either that same year in 256 or early the next year, 257. However, the population had been affected negatively. During the reign of Justinian I in the mid-6th century, there was another Persian invasion which succeeded in capturing Antioch. This time it was definitely the fault of the Antiochenes themselves. Justinian had sent his cousin Germanus in order to investigate the condition of the defenses at Antioch. He had seen that there was a fatal weakness in the walls that could not be repaired in time to prepare for the Sasanian invasion, so he advised the Antiochenes to surrender, and he himself arranged for them to pay a certain amount of money to the Persians in order for them to not attack the city. Then a relatively small Byzantine army arrived on the scene. The Antiochenes got way overconfident and decided to tell the king of Persia that he could kick rocks. They weren't going to pay him any money. He came to Antioch. He found the weakness in the walls immediately, stormed the city, and took his money and then some. So Antioch, for a lot of its history, had been this formidable fort, but after it became a place well behind the frontier, it lost a lot of its value as a fortress, and it was just another city when it came to its defensibility. By the 4th century, most Antiochenes had embraced Christianity, though not all. Interestingly enough, despite the fact that Antioch was known as being an especially Christian city, perhaps its most famous citizen of all time was a pagan during this Christian period. Libanius was born around 314 or so CE, and he was a renowned orator and proud pagan at a time when the empire's rulers and also his fellow citizens were almost entirely Christian. Libanius founded a school of rhetoric at Antioch, and this school, interestingly enough, ended up educating a pretty wide variety of students, some of whom were actually prominent Christian leaders, such as John Chrysostom, who we mentioned earlier. Libanius was also popular and prominent enough that he was invited to hang out with many of the emperors of his time, including the Christian ones such as Theodosius I, who actually made Libanius an honorary praetorian prefect in honor of his eloquence. Libanius's best friend on the imperial throne was Julian the Apostate, the pagan emperor, but that should come as no surprise. The two of them were planning something like a pagan revival at the time of Julian's death. Despite the fact that Julian's memory was somewhat condemned by his successors, Libanius's reputation didn't really suffer at all, which is testament to the man's charm and eloquence. His surviving corpus is relatively expansive, and it's an important resource for understanding the 4th century, and especially the sort of toxic 4th century discussions of religion. Speaking of Julian the Apostate, Antioch held a special place in his heart. Julian served as emperor from 361 to 363, only about 18 months in total, but when he came to the throne, he was an ardent pagan in an increasingly Christian world. His family, the Constantinian dynasty, had been responsible for making the Roman world more Christian, and Julian wanted to turn back the clock by creating a rival organization which would mirror the Christian church but be pagan in nature. It wasn't a very well-developed plan at the time that he died, and it would have been interesting if he had survived to try to develop this further. However, his last winter on Earth was the winter of 362 to 363, when he was planning an invasion of Persia. He decided to winter in Antioch while he organized his troops. Here he would find himself at odds with the local Christians and with the Antiochenes more broadly. There were a number of sources of this tension. One was that there was a general food shortage in Antioch when he brought his troops there to winter. He said that the people of Antioch were not doing nearly enough to try to stockpile food, and that they were trying to rely entirely on the emperor to provide them with foodstuffs for the winter. So he was somewhat bitter at them for that, and they in turn were bitter with him for bringing troops into the city at a time when there already wasn't enough to eat. So that was a major source of tension. However, there was also a religious aspect to all of this as well, as Julian was a well-known and outspoken pagan, and Antioch was perhaps the most Christian city in the empire. He would find himself being mocked a little bit in public, and he could tell that the people there simply didn't like him. He returned their feelings, and he wrote a work called the Mysopogon, Beard Hater, as a kind of self-deprecating, humorous send-up about how the locals didn't like him or accept him, but how he did his utmost to serve them anyway. It's kind of an example of Julian both trying to have a sense of humor in a rather humorless era, while also showing that he was frankly butthurt about the situation as a whole. It's a very fascinating work, and I recommend that anyone who's interested in learning about Julian's personality read it, because Julian is not a very funny guy, but he is trying his best here, and it also shows that he is trying to live up to that old Roman ideal of being able to take criticism and not punish people for expressing freedom of thought. The next summer, of course, Julian campaigned in Persia. The northern pincer army that was supposed to aid him did not arrive. The Persians were able to cut him off, and he died in a skirmish when he forgot to put on his breastplate before riding out to meet the Persians. With him died paganism's future. I can't help but to imagine that the people of Antioch were somewhat happy to hear about what happened to Julian in Persia. During the Middle Ages, the population of Antioch fell off dramatically, but it remained strategically important, and it was still something with a lot of symbolic and strategic significance. The city fell during the initial Arab invasions of the 630s and 640s, and while there was a successful counterattack at one point which retook the city, the Byzantines soon gave up on reclaiming it and decided instead to set up a defensive perimeter in Anatolia. There are also stories that the Antiochenes and many other former Byzantine subjects were tired of the high taxes that the Byzantines were imposing, as they had been on the front lines of first the long Persian-Byzantine War and then these Arab invasions, and they were content to live under the Arabs because early Islam was tolerant of Christians for the most part, and also the poll tax that they would charge would be much less than the tax rates of the empire. So the Antiochenes more or less just told the Byzantines that they could leave, much as they had told their previous Seleucid emperors the same thing. In 969, the Byzantines were at this point resurgent, and they were expanding into Syria. The Emperor Nicephorus II left a force under Michael Bortzes in the region in order to block any resupplies to the city of Antioch. Presumably, Nicephorus planned to return to the area the next year to finish off Antioch. However, his general Michael Bortzes was invited inside, and he launched a surprise attack. The Byzantines ended up taking the city. However, the emperor was displeased and removed him from command. Michael Bortzes then joined a plot to murder the emperor, which is not surprising given the ingratitude there. However, this was a strategically important development, as Antioch would prove to be a useful part of Byzantine frontier defense during the next century or so. The Byzantines were able to hold on to Antioch despite the massive defeat at Manzikert in 1071 all the way until 1084, when the Seljuk Turks were able to finally capture the city and thus deprive the Byzantines of their last major stronghold in Syria. A little bit after this, in the 1090s, the new emperor Alexius I Comnenus knew that he was not really able to retake Anatolia without outside help, so he called for the First Crusade, where he asked the Pope to send him Western Knights in order to bolster his forces. He didn't really envision it as a holy war, but the Pope did. So this ended up blossoming into the First Crusade, and the Crusaders had different ideas than the Byzantines. Alexius wanted to reclaim his lost eastern provinces, including Antioch and other places in Syria, whereas the Crusaders were mostly led by second sons and other men who had noble birth but did not have a patrimony to call their own. So they were looking to carve out little principalities for themselves, and this, of course, had the seeds of disaster built within it. The First Crusade was a success, but it was a bloody and prolonged one which had to overcome a number of long odds. In 1098, the Crusaders were able to capture Antioch, but instead of handing it over to the Byzantines as they had many of their previous captures, they instead decided to leave one of their own in charge of it and create a principality there. Similar things happened in Edessa, Tripoli, and later at Jerusalem. Although, to be fair, Jerusalem had not been part of the Byzantine Empire since the Arab invasions, so the emperors were not terribly displeased about the fall of Jerusalem and its independence. For many of the areas to the north of that, especially the Principality of Antioch, however, it struck them as a direct betrayal. What would end up happening is that the Prince of Antioch would become a bitter enemy of the Byzantine Emperor Alexius, and the two of them would feud to the end of their respective lives. The Principality of Antioch, for its part, tried to patch things up with the Byzantines over the next couple generations, so Alexius's son John II, and then grandson Manuel I. However, the relationship was never an easy one. Manuel did end up marrying a princess from Antioch, but even that was not successful at fully healing the breach between the two powers. Antioch and Byzantium would spend more time fighting each other than their supposed common enemies, or at least way too much time. And this feud between the two of them was something which undermined the security and success of Outremer. There were other cities in the region which should have been taken in order to shore up the position of Outremer, such as Damascus, which was further inland in Syria, but they never got around to that because the Antiochenes and the Byzantines were too busy fighting one another. Interestingly enough, Antioch was able to outsurvive almost all of the other portions of Outremer, and it survived all the way down until 1268, when the Mamluks were able to capture the city after a long decline and the loss of its access to its holdings in the south, such as some of the coastal cities in Tripoli. So Antioch had a long history as an independent power. It still exists today as an inhabited city in southern Turkey, but one couldn't really call it politically significant at this juncture in its history.